I'm not going to be able to cover all the stuff that was covered in the journal article, obviously. So I'll try and deal with some stuff and read the article, I would say, if you haven't done so already. One of the other things I make constant reference to in these meetings is an excellent book by this transgender activist here, Leslie Feinberg. And I know that there are a few copies that Books Marx has dug up. It's actually out of print, but it's called Transgender Warriors. And I think it's an absolutely superb book about history of trans and trans variants, gender variants, and so on. I suppose I should say, really, and after yesterday's mass strikes, that the best response to oppression for us is actually the kind of action that we saw yesterday. The fact that you stand shoulder to shoulder, you come out and strike with people who are black, white, men, women, gay, straight, transgender, or whatever, is the best form of mobilisation, really, the best form of building united fronts to resist oppression. That's in a way, it's a strike like yesterday is a much bigger step forward than any number of resolutions in a branch meeting. Not that we shouldn't fight to push those resolutions through branch meetings and fight for equal rights and fight for the reforms in the defence of what we've already won through the campaigning over LGBT issues particularly, but trans issues as well over the last 30 years. But the action, getting out, the way in which people's confidence develops, the way in which people become aware of the oppression that others suffer and we ourselves suffer, I think is epitomised, by yesterday's kind of action. I think I want to do three things really in this the next 30 minutes. Probably a bit of a tall order. I tried to do some of them last year and ended up only talking about ancient bloody Egypt and stuff, and never really getting up to the current situation. So I'm going to skip over a lot of that and try and concentrate on sort of trans issues, I think, over the last in the 20th century. I will need to say something though about the emergence of transphobia, which I think Leslie Feinberg's book does brilliantly. It's an assembly really of examples of gender variance in ancient societies, in former societies, in pre-class societies. Leslie is if people don't know who she is, she is a Marxist. She doesn't belong to the same tradition as the SWP, but she clearly comes from a Marxist position. She makes reference, for example, to Engels' origin, the origins, and so on. And I think it is really, really well worth reading, because what she does show is that the emergence of transphobia is very clearly linked to the emergence of class societies. And that if you look, for example, at she makes reference to the Bible, which is often used, isn't it, by bigots as to why homosexuality is wrong and gender variance is wrong. There's all the stuff in Deuteronomy and Leviticus that says, men shall not wear the raiment of women and so on and so forth. There's a reason why this is codified really in the emergence of class society at that time. And the reason essentially is because those societies in the Middle East at that time were emerging as more wealthy societies where those in power seriously began to think, well, how does my family, how do I hang on to the wealth that I've accumulated through trade or through bashing other people over the head and stealing what they've got, whatever. And when you start to ask those questions, issues of marriage, issues of the control of women's sexuality in particular become paramount, don't they? You want to know, for example, that your children are your children and not somebody else's children. You want your bloodline to inherit that which you have accumulated, and that was what was going on around about 2,000-3,000 years ago in the Middle East. Very rich area of the centre of the world, really, and the emergence of class societies clearly linked to the subjugation, the progressive subjugation of women, and the concomitant subjugation of variations in sexuality and variations in gender presentation. And you can, Leslie goes through a whole series of societies, some of which have survived more or less up to the present day, where there are very clear examples of not just actually the toleration of gender variant people and different people of different sexualities, but actually sometimes the veneration of such people. And you can look at examples, most people know of the kind of examples of North American Indian tribes, for example, who thought of gender not simply as two sexes, the binary division, which is, you know, the common modern, the universal, really, modern situation. We are taught, aren't we? We're socialised into a position where, you know, there are men and there are women. There is male and there is female. There's kind of nothing in between. And we're socialised into that. That binary system is hugely dominant. And it wasn't necessarily in the past. Other societies, earlier societies, have recognised different, not just different sexualities, but different genders. Sometimes 2, 3, 4 more genders have been recognised. I'm not trying to suggest that everything was always rosy in the garden and that there was always tolerance and toleration and respect to people who were presenting or wished to present as different genders. But it was clearly the case that those societies had a different, in many cases, had a very different attitude. And you can look around the world and see many, many examples of earlier societies, pre-class societies, where that was the case. And some of them have survived into modern times. You think about the Hijra in India, for example. You know, think of other communities, particularly in Southeast Asia, you know, where societies have existed for thousands of years. And some of them have existed. Pretty much, I have to say, pretty much pushed to the margins. You know, people talk about the Katoi of Thailand, for example. You know, of whom there are hundreds of thousands. Tend to be kind of presented in the West, don't they, as kind of ladyboys and so on. There's programs on telly and whatnot. Those societies have existed for quite a long time, but pretty much pushed to the margins of society. It's only, I think, in the last 3 or 4 years, actually, that some Katoi have been employed, for example, in what we might call regular employment. So there were several Katoi who were hired in the the Thai airline, and got jobs, like, you know, proper jobs in the economy, as it were, rather than restricted to, you know, which has been the fate, unfortunately, of many trans communities and trans people, of being driven out of not just your homes but your jobs and so on, driven out of the economy and forced to exist on the margins, the economic margins of society. So working, for example, in entertainment or in the sex trade is, you know, often the only option for many trans people to this day, obviously, also around the world. So I think that if you get to look at the book, I think you'll see that there are convincing examples of former societies, pre-class societies, in which sexuality and gender was much more fluid and much more accepted. And it's the rise of class society which has narrowed the potential and led to the oppression of women, but also the oppression of gays, to homophobia, to transphobia, and so on. Interestingly, Leslie dedicates the book to, she describes, 2 transgender warriors who fell in battle. Brandon Teena, people will know the film. Do you know the film? In the 90s, which Brandon Teena was a trans man who was outed by the police in America and ended up being beaten to death. This is in the 1993-ish, I think, around about that time. Marsha Johnson, who actually I have a photograph of Marsha together with Sylvia Rivera on one of the prides in New York a bit later on. Marsha Johnson, might as well tell you now rather than when the photograph comes up, was found dead in the Hudson River immediately after, I think it was the 1992 Gay Pride March in New York. Found dead. Many people in the community believe that she was murdered, and you know, the evidence, all the circumstantial evidence, seems to prove that she was, and the police never investigated it. So, you know, her end was, unfortunately, like so many trans people, was a violent end. You don't have to go far. I mean, I'm not going to spend lots of time on the extreme transphobia which people suffer in many parts of the world, because, you know, the examples are there. You only need to go on the, you know, on a website like Remembering Our Dead, for instance, to find that there are hundreds of examples of trans people who are the subject of the most extreme violence. I mean, you know, machine gun to death, burned to death, machine gun to death and burned to death. You know, I mean, just horrific stuff, and it seems to really touch a nerve. And I don't know if I'll get to it, but, you know, one of the conclusions really from so many of the studies that have been done on homophobia and transphobia is that homophobia, it remains in a very big way, you know, and in some countries it's actually got worse. Transphobia is in many estimations worse. It's worse than homophobia. It's more widespread and can be more extreme as well. And there's quite a lot of evidence for that. So what I want to do, I think what I want to argue is that there is a whole history of trans resistance, really, which is there for us to be aware of and to reclaim, and that we have a process to engage in to do that, and it's only really been possible, I think, in the last maybe 10 years or so to begin to address that question, and I will come back to that in a minute. Secondly, I think it's an argument really which applies to all forms of oppression in capitalist society, which is the roots of oppression are material roots. They do exist at an ideological level in terms of the ideas that people have in their heads and so on, but they are rooted in the material circumstances of the society in which we live. Therefore, they're not born into us, and they're not immutable, they're not unchangeable. Those ideas can be challenged, and those ideas, you know, the conclusion of that, I suppose, if they're part of and arise from the material circumstances of the societies in which we live, is that you have to therefore change the nature of the society in which you live fundamentally in order to undermine and in order to end and destroy the various oppressions that we suffer. And, you know, clearly transphobia is part of that, and it actually goes really to the root, as I said before, of the serious challenge really to the understanding in society of a binary system of gender, which can shake people to their roots, I guess, especially if you happen to be transgender and you suddenly realise that, well, actually, gosh, I'm not sure I think the binary system really works for me at all. Bloody hell, what do I do about that? And you know, it's a kind of a dawning that comes to many trans people quite early on in their lives, that they can spend decades trying to deal with and come to terms with. So I want to do that, and it comes down to, in that respect, it does come down to an understanding of the nature of the family. In capitalist society in particular, not just capitalist society, but particularly capitalist society, because the family, the nuclear family, has developed in ways which were not really there in earlier forms of society, but since the kind of 19th century have developed in ways which have become particularly restrictive for trans people and for you know, Lgbt people in general. So I think I'm going to move on from, if I can find the thingy to press. I hope this works. Oh, it does. Good. Right, this is really kind of horrible. It's a woodcut from 1594, Theodore Debris engraving of Balboa using dogs to murder two-spirit native people. I put this in because I think it's a particularly extreme example, but for how, you know, it gives you an indication of how long these forms of extreme transphobia have been going on, and the role of colonialism and the church in this as well, the Christian church. I mean, these were people who went to the Americas, I mean, engaged in the most horrible extremes, really, of colonial domination. This is just one example, really. In the article, I mean, I found loads of quotes. I had to cut a lot of them out, unfortunately, for space. But there was some really quite, I mean, obviously shocking stuff. There was one that sticks in my head about, I think it was Balboa, who quotes. The quote is that his soldiers had captured a native, a warrior in a battle, who was dressed in the clothes of dressed and fought very bravely in the clothes of a woman. Because he was obviously a sodomite, we burned him to death. And that's just a little example of the kind of approach that they had. And this was one of the, the most extreme really forms of finding two-spirit people, the kind of native term. Many native people use that term for people who are gender variant in various ways, and they basically set the dogs on them to tear them to bits. It should be pointed out, I think, that this was to also to destroy the morale of the people who were the enemies of the colonialists, because often the people they were putting to death here would have been highly respected people in those societies. They're often teachers, religious leaders, sometimes war leaders as well, who often had a special place in those societies. So by destroying them, you destroy the resistance, or you help to destroy the resistance to the colonialists as well. Okay. There are lots of other examples. I mean, the Americas is only one. If you look back, I mean, for example, in Africa, there are examples of transgender and transvestite kings, for example. Something which many people, those who are kind of leading the reaction, I suppose, to LGBT people in Africa deny. Often the argument is that homosexuality and gender variants are imports, Western imperialist imports to Africa, and a little look in history, a little look at this book will make it very clear that that's actually not the case. So I want to try and move on to how long have I got?
You currently have 20 more minutes.
All right, good. Okay, up to today, I think would be good. Conchita Wurst. Now, I don't know about you, but I think I would rather have my eyes gouged out with a rusty corkscrew than watch Eurovision Song Contest. Despite my grandchildren trying to bribe me with chocolate to watch it last night. But I couldn't believe it when Conchita Wurst won. I thought, bloody hell, that's really good. And actually, I know it's the frame of reference here is not exactly revolutionary politics, is it? But the fact that Conchita Wurst won is a real blow, wasn't it, to many of the bigots, particularly because a whole number of the judges from some of the countries in Eastern Europe that are in the forefront of cracking down on LGBT rights and so on, did vote for Conchita. And she then kind of toured. I saw her interviewed on Newsnight, sort of striking a blow really for at least toleration. And it really got up the bloody nose of the bigots, didn't it? I don't know if you saw the response. I found an article in the Huffington Post. I'm sure you're aware of this, but apparently Conchita Wurst is to blame for the flooding in the Balkans. This was the literal head of Montenegro reportedly said that the floods were not a coincidence but a warning, explaining that the extreme weather was a sign that people must reject the Jesus-like figure of Wurst. Yes, there was that struck me as the same kind of quote as we got from the UKIP councillor, remember, who sort of blamed gays for the floods in the east of England a few months ago. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on transphobia today. There are plenty of examples. I happened to come across this in the Observer about 3 weeks ago. This was a story about Kate Stone, I don't know if any people saw that. Kate Stone, who was, suffered the misfortune of being gored by a stag. So much for a quiet walk in the countryside. But she ended up seriously ill in hospital. Almost died. When the papers got hold of it, all they could talk about was the fact that Kate was transgender, and they concentrated on this. Sex change. Walker gored by whatever. Those kind of headlines, those sort of sensationalist headlines are not very far away, are they? You can find them, and the more bigoted newspapers are happy to retail these. Last year, a lot of us were involved in the Lucy Meadows case of raising solidarity, really, and a response to Lucy Meadows' tragic suicide. And I know I wasn't at the NUT conference, not my union, but I was told there was a very moving speech by one of the delegates, a transgender delegate there, who talked about how difficult it had been for her to come out in her school and the way she'd been treated by the school. I have to say, by the way, Lucy Meadows' school was actually very good. Faith school, no less, was actually very good. But other people have had, the most appalling experiences of being driven out of their jobs and kind of marginalised. As we probably know, levels of unemployment, homelessness, and so on among particularly young LGBT people generally, but among trans youth is incredibly high. The figures are there. You look at just about every survey that's been done, and the figures are really shocking. I looked up, for the article, I looked up figures for suicide and suicide attempts, and it was quite funny, actually. I put the figures in, which are huge. I mean, it's like something like 50% of transgender people have attempted suicide at some time. Okay, that's enormous. The general rate in the population is about 6%. And I remember I sent the draft of the article off to the editors of the ISJ, and a query came back and said, could you check this figure, because it does seem a little bit high. Is it really 50%? I said, no, yes, it is. It is. People kill themselves. Lots of people kill themselves as a result of transphobia, and it's appalling. So there are all those kind of examples which I think we could talk about. Again, the case of Cece McDonald in America, who attacked by transphobic bigots, defended herself. There was a fight. The person who attacked her died in the fight, and she was the one charged and ended up in jail. She's just come out, actually. I think came out in about January or February this year, but served several years in jail. And of course, for many countries, if you're transgender and you end up going to prison, the chances are you'll be sent to a male or a female prison, whatever your birth certificate tells the courts you are, rather than what you present as. And of course, if you end up in that situation, that in itself is, opens you up to violence and opens you up to potential murder as well inside the penal system. So, as I say, there are plenty of examples, and the context more generally, I suppose, is one that we should at least be aware of, which is the huge assault on the gains that we've made right across the board in terms of equality over the last 30 years or so, and by the way, which the trade union movement has played an incredibly important part in pushing forward. In this country, much of the legislation that now exists in terms of equality has come from what some of the pioneers did in the 70s and the 80s inside the trade union movement and inside the TUC and so on, and pushing all that stuff forward. The Gender Recognition Act is a big step forward for gender variant people, but it is something which is incomplete, and it's something which we need to be aware of. Can be rolled back. These things can be rolled back. When they're looking for scapegoats, you see it now in terms of Islamophobia in particular in this country, don't you? You see it now. These things can be rolled back, and we have to stand up all the time to fight to make sure that those things remain. Okay, moving on. I haven't got that many slides, but it's clearly too many. Okay, I want to go back because one of the other, I think, key conclusions out of a meeting like this is that when we have made, it flows from the point I just made, when we have made big advances in terms of LGBT rights and towards liberation, which is what we're after, aren't we? We're not just after equal rights, we are actually after a society in which we are liberated. All of us, whether you're LGBT or straight, actually, all our lives are distorted by the kind of system that we are forced to live in, and the state which defends that society. But if you look back, there's a history in terms of LGBT activism which is clearly linked to the socialist movement, and it's a history that unfortunately was more or less lost in the period of the 1930s. I'll come to it briefly in a minute, and it's one that's had to be recovered, and it's a very, very important one. People like Edward Carpenter, for instance, who was a sort of very courageous activist who lived in my hometown in Guildford for a time as well. Tireless gay activist, founder of the Independent Labour Party, founder of the Fabian Society. Okay, we reformist organisations, but very importantly linked to the trade union movement and linked to socialist ideas, not Marxist ideas in his case. Magnus Hirschfeld on the continent. Again, there was a very strong movement within the Social Democratic Party, the SDP of Germany. Hirschfeld, who is that man, founded the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin in 1990 during the German Revolutionary period. That institute was destroyed in 1933 by the Nazis. Contrary to what many, even trans people, think, the first sex change operations were not in America or Casablanca in the 1950s. Actually, they were carried out in Hirschfeld's institute in the the sort of 1920s, middle to late 1920s. So, very advanced, in terms of what they were thinking. Here, I've put this up because it's pretty bloody important for us. The Russian Revolution, 1917. When you say to people, LGBT, trans people, whatever, you say to them, well, do you realise how seriously the Bolsheviks took the question of women's oppression, how seriously they took the question of oppression, how when Lenin talked about, revolutionaries, Marxists must be the tribunes of the oppressed, it was not just words. Not only were a number of Bolsheviks and leading revolutionaries advocates, for example, of free love and open relationships and so on, fighters for women's liberation, but they put it into practice in the first successful workers' revolution. Just within 2 months of that revolution, I think I've got these in the wrong order. Sorry. Anyway, that's the Nazis burning Hirschfeld's thing. Sorry, I'll go back. I took that slide out. The point I'm trying to make here, that within 2 months of the revolution, the Bolsheviks had decriminalised homosexuality, had begun the process of opening facilities, creche facilities, collectivised creche facilities, collectivised childcare, and so on. And you think about the context in which that took place. This is just after the revolution, when the revolution is trying to establish itself, when there's a threat of invading armies, when there must be many other things on your mind if you're in the Bolshevik Central Committee or whatever, and yet you make damn sure that these measures go through. Why? Because that is the heart of the revolutionary project. It is about liberation. It is about taking every step to oppose that oppression and to make possible the liberation of oppressed people in society. Anyway, that was the high. In a way, that was the high point. This marks, I suppose, the low point. The rise of the Nazis, the sort of the freedoms that existed in Germany in the Weimar Republic, for not massive freedoms, but there was significant freedoms, significant culture for LGBT people, was rolled back in the 1930s, both actually in Stalinist Russia, but also in under the Nazis. Right. Okay, and this is thought to be a picture of the destruction of Hirschfeld's clinic. Okay, it's almost unreadable, isn't it? Sorry about that. I want to jump forward because there was a very kind of gradual development of gay and trans support groups and organisations after the Second World War. I mean, it took a long time really to recover. But what you do find is that by the time you get to the 60s, the idea that gender variance, for example, is not the same thing as sexuality. That they have to be seen differently, and because early on it was all lumped together. You know, in the sense that very often male homosexuals were seen as, well, completely wrongly, were seen as sort of expressing femininity in some way, expressing effeminate behaviour, and there was not really the distinction between homosexuality and trans issues, being trans, being transgender rather than being gay, and gradually that emerged. Trans emerged as a kind of a separate sort of issue. It's not the same. It's not about sexual orientation. It's about your gender presentation, your gender identity. It's not the same thing at all. By the time you get to the 1960s, you're getting a generalised emergence of movements, particularly in America, but in Europe as well, over issues of racism, over issues of women's oppression, and you're also getting this in terms of the beginnings of fightbacks over LGBT issues. And this demonstrates. It was Gene Compton's. It was a cafe in San Francisco, cafeteria, right, 1966. 3 years before Stonewall, actually. Just want to chalk that one up for trans people. It was a riot which, as it says here, took place one August night when transgender women and gay men stood up for their rights and fought against police brutality, poverty, oppression and discrimination in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. And they used the methods of collective, working class resistance. They used the pickets, and they sort of marched about outside and boycotted the place and so on. And it went on, and there was, there was a riot. There's a great film called Screaming Queens, by the way, which is by Susan Stryker, who's written a good but not a socialist history of transgender experiences in America that you can get on YouTube if you want. It's called Screaming Queens. Because at the time, all transgender people were, or certainly transgender women, were lumped in as, in this sort of ubiquitous term of queens. It was everybody was a queen, even though it's not the same. You know what I'm on about. And it was this is the first plaque really that dedicates that. There were other examples of collective resistance over being thrown out of cafes, being refused service, and so on and so forth. That was the one at Gene Compton's riot, the riot at Gene Compton's cafe. Moving on quickly, people will be aware of, Stonewall, 1969. We had the anniversary, a few years ago. It's worth pointing out that trans people were very much a part of the Stonewall resistance. 4 nights of fighting the police, out of which emerged the Gay Liberation Front. And people like Sylvia Rivera, who died a few years ago, were integral to that resistance. Sylvia was one of those who was profiled in Martin Duberman's book, the kind of classic book on Stonewall, called Stonewall. And this, in a way, this was a kind of highlight of demonstrating the way in which the emergence of movements against oppression in the 60s and the anti-war movement in America, the tactics and the ideas fed into other oppressed groups' resistance as well, such as gays and trans people. Okay, and that was I think that was a very important step. The problem was that by the mid-1970s, that kind of alliance between trans people particularly and gay activists had begun to break apart. And it began to break apart because the revolutionary surge, if you like, around the sort of late 60s had begun to dissipate. The level of class struggle was beginning to decline, and the concomitant result of that politically was the kind of breakup of the emergence really of a reformist strategy rather than a revolutionary strategy. And whereas people like Sylvia Rivera and a lot of the trans people stuck to that notion of they wanted trans liberation, not an accommodation with the system, there were many, many gay activists who said, well, actually, no, what we want to do is change city ordinances. We want we want better rights, equal rights. You know, we don't need to transform society to do that. We need to pass laws. We can pass some laws. And there was a notion of the emerging, you know, homonormativity, really, the idea that what you wanted to do, what you wanted to end up with was to be accepted within capitalist society rather than to overthrow that society. And people like Sylvia, she remained true right up to the end, actually. She and others formed a thing called Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. And she tried to reform it again back in the early 2000s, just a few years before she died in poverty. One reason she died is because, like many trans people, she had difficulty accessing healthcare. You know, you look at the figures again. It shocked me when I wrote the article. The number of trans people who reported not just being refused access to healthcare, like GPs and doctors, but actually suffering violence in the surgery, being thrown out because they had gone to the doctor for support. You know, that's the kind of everyday thing that's happening to trans people. So, I'm told to wrap up, and there's, as usual, a great deal that I haven't said, but hopefully people can contribute in the discussion. I guess the conclusion I want to keep putting out there really is that there is a long history of transgender resistance to transphobia. There's a history that is something we need to recover, and that history is one in which we have to understand the context of the society in which the oppression takes place. That ultimately you can challenge that, but you have to challenge it through changing the society that you live in. Ultimately, transphobia can't be got rid of until you change the society and the material conditions that give rise to transphobia, and that requires questions then about, well, how do we do that? How do we do that? And at the end of the day, it's a question of building the kind of organisation that is capable of building the sort of united fronts that can push that whole campaign, that whole strategy forward. And I think I'll leave it there and people can come in.
Hello. I'd like to raise a point which is, I think this sometimes gets lost in the whole discussion about transgender. Many people who go through a transsexual process, a large proportion, want simply to be accepted in the gender they change to. So if they change from male to female, they want to be accepted as a woman, particularly after their surgery. And a big problem that those people face, I think, in a sense contrary to what is said about the whole issue of transgender, is the conflation of their condition with homosexuality. When it's a simple thing that they simply want to be accepted in the gender that they have changed to. Now, I will end quickly, but I think there's an interesting example in this context that when we take the bearded lady, Miss Worst, who won the Eurovision Song Contest. No disrespect to her personally and her style, but you see that the media will seize on that kind of exceptional example, just like the numerous talk show examples of gay icons, Graham Norton and so on, and the media will promote them and they become, perhaps they fail later on, but they become famous. Whereas the average person who's been through a sex change and may have numerous talents is almost completely shut out of the media industry. Not just the question of being well known, but it's almost completely cut out of the media industry, in music, in the arts, in comparison with the bearded lady that I mentioned. And I just think that needs to be said. And great respect to you, and perhaps you can reply to that point later on.
I just got a question. It seems to me a slight contradiction when you say in former societies sexuality was much more fluid, yeah? And on the other hand, in capitalism you are either this or that, so you have to define yourself. But basically, however many definitions you have, and you used different definitions, sometimes you said LGBT or whatever you said from time to time, yeah. But however we define it, I mean, do we have to define anything, or why is capitalism forcing us to define us in any way? Yeah, I mean, we're just human beings, yeah, with different tastes at different times, and if we live long enough, perhaps we develop even more tastes in the course of our lives. Yeah, so that's just basically the question.
Yeah, it's just a really quick point, and I work with children, young people, in a child and adolescent mental health unit. And if we have young people who are wondering about their gender, or it's considered a mental health difficulty, and I think that's just quite shocking in this day and age, that when people become 18 and go on to adult services and decide that they do want to have a gender change, that actually one of the most insulting things to people is that they have to go through a mental health service in order to, the unit that in London anyway that deals with gender change is actually a mental health unit, and I just think that's really shocking that in this day and age that we're still considering issues around gender as a mental health problem.
Yeah, I guess I was just going to sort of come back on a couple of things that people have said already, really. That there's a recent article in the New Statesman by Laurie Penny where she talks about the transgender tipping point, and she says that that is, we've come to a point in our society where transgender people are, a bigger part of the media, which kind of contradicts what you would say, but she sort of says that we've got transgender characters on TV and TV shows, and they're coming to the fore in public life and being more, transgender issues are being discussed as a big debate, and that people on the left have to sort of decide where they stand on these issues, whether they are supporting the fight for trans liberation and stuff like that. And she also talks about like the sort of language around gender. So I've only really been reading about this recently, but the idea of cisgender people or cissexual and stuff, that people who don't consider themselves to be trans are taking the term cis, which is supposed to mean, it's sort of in order to stop people from thinking that that cisgender people are the norm and that actually transgender people are something abnormal. And I think it's really interesting, this argument around that use of language, and I just wondered if Laura would sort of comment more on what you think about the use of the word cis, and whether it's something that's actually helpful in the fight for trans liberation, or whether it's something that actually in an ideal world we'd like to have a situation where people don't have to define their gender or their sexuality or anything like that. But do you think that it's the case that we're at a point now where the use of the word cis is going to be useful or not?
In Ireland next year we're going to have a referendum on marriage equality. Basically, we're hoping to follow suit with I think here in Britain and I think in France. To me, the referendum should not just to me it's not going to be an end battle for marriage equality. To me, it should still mean that for the LGBT community, particularly in Ireland, not just in Ireland, but it should develop where we want to have people, and not only just LGBT, but to have free love, to be able to live their lives in happiness. But there's been other debates. There's been other debates within our left about the Chelsea Manning issue. I mean, that was actually one thing I was wondering. It didn't come up in Laura's talk. I was wondering, where do you think we should, not just here in Britain, but the LGBT community, the Marxist Socialist currency and the left in general should, I don't know, bring further awareness or bring Chelsea Manning, because she wanted, when she was jailed, she wanted to be called Chelsea Mann, and she wanted to have an operation, and she can't even have any of that, and like things seem to be in limbo for her. She's in jail, and like there was protests, but things are kind of just stopped at the moment. And I was just wondering if, because reinvigorating her fight will reinvigorate the fight for all the LGBT community.
I mean, you touched on it briefly in the idea of Marxism uses a way of kind of dividing us as a form of oppression, and so that being the reason why, we divide into binary genders of males and females. And the lady who spoke about transgender being classified as sort of a mental health issue, and I think the other thing is my friend's going through at the moment where she has to go to a board, and the board have to decide whether or not she can legally become a woman and get her passports and everything changed to being a woman. And it's this weird situation where you feel you have to be proven, you have to prove something, whereas if you're born a certain way, no one else asks you and to prove it for anybody else. And I just wanted to know why that is the case. Is it just a form of divide and rule in capitalism that they want to exclude these people, criminalise it, medicalise it, to make them seem different, and like you said, abnormal, like the idea of using psi, so it's not normal and then transgender. And I just kind of wanted to hear your viewpoints on that, because it's a very interesting tool that I think capitalism is using to separate us, and I just wanted to hear a bit more about how you felt about it.
Yeah, I've got one question that I want to put. I'm also from the Irish SWP. Earlier in the year we were discussing LGBT issues, and we had some comrades who moved a motion that said we shouldn't say LGBT, we should say LGBTQ. In other words, you should add Q for queer onto the LGBT set of initials. When discussing this issue, we had other comrades who said they weren't happy with that because they thought queer was still offensive to considerable numbers of people in the LGBT community, and it would be a mistake to use it. We didn't really resolve the issue. I'd be interested to know what Laura or anybody else here thinks on that question. As a genuine open question. But the other point I want to make, following on from that, was in response about the cis, the use of cis, and the use also of things like heteronormative and so on. It's just a word of caution. Fundamentally, this is not about names and language. As Marxists, we understand this is fundamentally about social relations. We have to bear this in mind, because there's can be a slight danger on the left, especially when you're talking about people who are either experienced or part of the student world or whatever, where the question of language, which is easy to fix, you just start using one word, can seem to be the crucial question, and then you get a kind of snobbish attitude to working class people who haven't learned the language yet. I don't mind, to be honest, whether people call themselves cis or whatever they call themselves, but I don't think that we should elevate this to a principle when you're dealing with people on the picket line or wherever else it is. My God, don't you know? You shouldn't call yourself straight, you should call yourself cis, and so on. And I think that could be a problem. And I think that's important to bear in mind when we're interacting with working class people. What really counts is the real social relations that exist between people, because the language can easily be done. You can easily oppress people for being LGBT quite easily if you don't. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter, but it's not the fundamental thing. I think we have to bear that in mind.
It was just, I just wanted to make an observation about, I think it was yourself who was saying about asking some questions about how does transphobia help capitalism, how does it help with the dividing, and I think you're right, it helps with the dividing and the scapegoating. And one observation on that actually refers to what the first contributor said about the Eurovision Song Contest, because I think the Eurovision Song Contest stuff is quite contradictory, because on the one hand it's right to say it can be brilliant to see transgender people in the forefront, in the media, winning competitions. It's quite exciting in the one sense, but on the other hand there is such a gap between transgender people as spectacle in winning big shows to the life of transgender people in the workplace, where people, you know, who are part of the working class but face absolute victimisation, harassment, as you said yourself, people driven not just out of their jobs but in some cases harassed into committing suicide and worse, who are part of our class. So I think there is a contradiction at the heart of that, and you're right, scapegoating is part of the divide and rule of what capitalism does, to say, you know, we want to divide people and pit people against each other. But I think when it comes to questions of gender and sexuality, it's also about the role that the family plays under capitalism, which the family is absolutely central to capitalism, because it's where capitalism gets free labour of bringing up the next generation of people who are going to be the workers. Actually, not just bringing up children now, more and more the burden of looking after older relatives falls on the family. And when we say it falls on the family, it still predominantly falls on women. And this is why this is absolutely the root of women's oppression. But it's also, even though most people don't actually live in the nuclear family, take in Britain for example, the ideology of the nuclear family is still so absolutely solid, and then it's backed up by all the various legislation that the Tories tried to bring in, tax breaks for married couples and all the rest of it. It's held up by the church as the normal way that people should live. It's backed up ideologically in lots and lots of ways, and coming out of that comes the stereotype of what a man and a woman in a family should be, and what a gender norm should be in a woman or in a man. And out of that also comes the idea that there must be something wrong with homosexuality, so homophobia. So all of the questions of gender and sexuality in one way or another are bound up with this notion of the family. And that's why I think it's also important that we say the people who are on the absolute cutting end of this sort of prejudice are people who are facing transphobia and homophobia actually, which can also be quite brutal at times. But let's not kid ourselves that all of our genders and sexualities aren't distorted by the system in which we live, where sexuality becomes a commodity, where what it is to be a woman in itself is distorted by the world in which we live, or what it is to be a man. And I think when you think about liberation, this goes back to the old demands of the gay liberation movement, and the gay and LGBT movement should be for liberation for all of us, that we want to live in a society where gender and identity and all of these things don't mean the little boxes that they're trying to push us into all the time under capitalism.
Yeah, basically I just wanted to say how I take great heart, great hope from a meeting taking place here like this. And I'd just like to tell you why. I hit puberty in the 1950s. Okay, I was aware that I was falling in love with boys. Now this posed an incredible problem then. I'd never heard of transsexuality. There was no word like gay in use. There were some horrendous words, and what happened to people was absolutely awful. Now it occurred to me, my girl cousin had pictures of all these boys on her bedroom wall. I had to have them in a drawer hiding under my socks and underpants. Okay, I thought then the only way I could fall in love with a boy as if I became a girl. Now, that's not what I wanted. It never occurred to me in the 50s I could fall in love with a boy and I could still be a boy. That might seem amazing because most of you are less than half my age. This has changed, and I just take tremendous heart and tremendous hope. This sort of meeting could never have taken place. It couldn't have taken place in my 20s. I could have gone to prison for having sex till I was 24. You know, I'm stood here now, I can live my life. Okay, as a gay man, other people can live as trans. But that's all happened in quite a short space of time. Well, you might not think so, I think it's a short space of time. And I really do take tremendous heart and tremendous hope from the future that, you know, there's these people here and there's hundreds and thousands more outside. And I just think it's fantastic.
couple of points. The issue about people actually going to a psychiatrist before they actually have any form of gender reassignment. It's not just a question of degrading, but it's a question of what is the agenda that the psychiatrists are using to define femininity, and this, which is generally where it comes up. This is actually very worrying, and I think we need to actually politically engage with. I think the thing about LGBTQ, etc., I think the important thing is it's the same as when a person actually decides that they actually want to be treated like a woman, and they want to be treated and referred to as her. It's a question of actually comradely civility about how you define people, how they wish to be defined. And I remember the thing about many years ago when there was a strike on the Timex factory, and a whole load of gay people went down there and to support the strikers, and they were actually outside chanting, "We're here, we're queer, and we won't scab the Timex." Now, I'm more interested in the fact that they're actually down there actually showing solidarity with the strike and actually than actually slightly redundant arguments about whether queer is correct, etc., etc. I think you actually do get bogged down into arguments. But one question I did want to ask, which concerns me, and I'm unfamiliar with the facts, but it's the way that the bourgeois system actually uses the whole concept of gender reassignment as a form of normalisation of homosexuality, because there were reports that, for example, in apartheid South Africa, there were gay men who actually were coerced into sex changes by the system to actually normalise them, and I think this is now going on in Iran. Like I've had reports. I don't know, I just want to ask if you could come back on that.
Yeah, I think it's important to say humans aren't actually necessarily born male or female. You do get intersexual people, but actually under society they have to have male or female on their birth certificate, although I think Germany has now said that it can actually be unclassified. Yeah. But it doesn't matter. When you go to school, when you first go to nursery or school, you'll be classified as male or female. And I think although we talk about, there's been liberation and women's pay is only 20% less than men's instead of 40% less as it was in 75 when they brought the Equal Pay Act in. Actually, in some ways, when you look at the society around you, you see that the pressures to conform to gender norms are incredibly great now. And the complete division when you go into a clothes store and there's the girls and it's all pink and there's the boys, it's all blue. Definitely, my mum says it wasn't like that when I was a kid. You didn't actually have this massive divide that you have now. This force, they don't force you to accept one gender or another. As the last speaker said, it is true in Iran. If you're gay and you go for gender reassignment, then they view it as actually become, you're born with the wrong body, but we've made you a woman, so now it's sort of acceptable. There is an element of that. And the thing is, it's not just religious people who say it. It's also non-religious people who still argue that homosexuality isn't natural. And one other thing that people have said is one of the books here is talking about marriage equality, which is a big issue at the moment in the States, and in a lot of countries. I mean, they're saying actually marriage equality is wrong because then you were conforming to the normalisation of the family. And I'd argue actually we should have the right to marry or not as we choose. So actually, although I disagree with gender, the binary notions of gender, I disagree that that you should have to have one man and one woman, or one or two men or two women. You should be able to have one, two. You should have 2, 3, 4. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be as restrictive as it is. We shouldn't label ourselves. It's still progress if we have the right to choose whether or not we want to get married. The point is that is not liberation, and we need to recognise about our fight is about going beyond that, and about beyond the notions of binary gender, and beyond the notions of actually we determining when a baby is born. A doctor determining whether it has surgery to make it more fully male or fully female, which is what happens to some kids at the moment. And we have a society where everything around it is so binary gender orientated. It's actually quite sad growing up, seeing it now and thinking actually when I grew up, in some ways, although we didn't have as much LGBT liberation and laws to protect us, actually it seems to be worse. And just in case people don't know, there are actually laws now protecting trans people. You shouldn't be identified as trans by anybody if you don't want to, unless it should be your choice. If you want to publicly identify as a woman that you were born with a different gender, or vice versa, look how much protection that law gives you in the media.
I just wanted to ask you a personal question about how much more do you understand about sexism now since becoming a woman?
Yeah. We still do have a few more minutes for contributions if people want to contribute or ask a question.
I appreciated everyone's interventions. However, I was wondering, because at the beginning one of the first things you said is that still nowadays we have to face a lot of homophobia in the world, but probably transphobia is even worse. And what we were talking about there was actually looking at the definition of LGBT. And as much as I do understand why it was created, this definition, you know, this umbrella, and obviously how much LGBT movement has done for all the different, for different categories over, let's say, the last 150 years. So, at the same time, you know, LGBT is supposed to be about sexuality, while transgender is about gender. And I do think at this point, one reason why probably not so much, but at least a little bit has been achieved with regards to the rights of gay, lesbians and bisexual people, is because that's just about sexuality. So when it's about sexuality, you know, we kind of got used to say, okay, people can do what they want with their sexuality, you know, they can have sex with whoever they want, and that's about, you know, lesbian, gays and bisexual, but it's also about whoever else, you know, you can be as creative as you want with your own sexuality. And then because of that, obviously you can, you know, in certain countries, obviously only, you can also become a father, you know, you can have gay couples adopting children, and actually you can even get married and everything. But at the same time, all these you know, rights that have been obtained don't really tackle the issue of gender. And that's why I do think probably for transgender people is more difficult to obtain any, because at that point you really have to challenge the bigger sort of definition, you know, and there's a bigger structure, and it's much more difficult to tackle that, because sexuality, yeah, as I say, you just say, okay, I don't care what you do when you're in bed, but when you meet, say, the way you want a transgender person, you actually have to really question your own assumptions about gender, and I think there's much deeper sort of process that you have to undergo. That's it. Thank you.
There's an awful lot of points there, and apologies to anybody that I miss out because I haven't got very much time. I'll try and get briefly on some of them. You asked me a personal question. Thankfully, it wasn't that personal. Sometimes you get really personal ones. Well, yeah, I mean, yes, I won't spend much time on that, but the experience of being in my car driving, making a mistake, and some bloke screaming stupid bitch at me was a little bit of an education, because that had never happened before. So I don't know, that's a bit trite, but you know what I mean. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff about terminology, and I agree with what people have said about not kind of getting hung up on the terminology. I know some people do like, you know, prefer LGBTQ, or in terms of trans, there'd be star trans or trans star and so on. You know, I did look at this a little bit in the article, but I didn't really dwell on it, because I agree with when people say it isn't the central issue, and the problem with it is, if you start trying to define further and further divisions, actually that's what you do. You fall into that kind of identity politics approach, which is to say, well, actually, you know, I'm really not quite the same as you, therefore I must have some different interests here, mustn't I? You know, and it chops up, you know, those who are oppressed into smaller and smaller groups. So I think it's really problematic. I must say, you know, we had a debate some years ago in my district actually about the use of queer, and I kind of am one of those people who I do get twitchy about the use of the term queer. It's, you know, I come from a period when queer was a very direct and revolting insult, and I find it difficult to, as it were, reclaim a term like that. But I know some people find that sums up their situation, their position, and it's fine. You know, you know, if that's what people want, you can go on, you know, acronym chopping as much as you want. But to be honest with you, the reason I prefer to use LGBT is because that's the term that's generally preferred in the labour movement. And there's a good reason for that, actually. There was a whole debate in the 90s inside the labour movement about whether the T, trans, should be added to LGB. It was one that I was involved in, and it was one that led to my coming out at the time as trans in my union conference, because I thought the notion of keeping them separate was wrong. And what's the material, if you like, the struggle basis for that? The struggle basis for that was that in the 90s, and from the 80s and the 90s, many trans people and lesbian and gay people, particularly gay men, needed to come together to fight for decent health care and for funding in the fight against HIV. People think, well, trans, why? We can see gay men, yeah, why? Because trans is one of the highest risk groups for HIV/AIDS. Trans women are very high risk. The figures, I was looking the other day, the figures on a number of surveys are anything between 6%, and 68% in some countries of trans women are HIV positive. Now that raises all sorts of issues about whether you can access healthcare, legitimately, and whether your life is going to be saved. And this was during the 80s, was a period in which it pulled together people, and they felt they had to campaign. One of the reasons, perhaps, why LGBT equal rights has moved on to such an extent as it has done is because those groups did form and did fight. There's a problem now, actually, one that came up at through the TUC LGBT conference just recently, which was, well, why haven't we seen any kind of widespread resistance to austerity from LGBT groups now? Because we're being hit extremely hard by the cuts. In terms of, support for homeless young people. You can go on and on, the list is endless. Why isn't there a generalised fight back? And there was a bit of a debate, something we maybe could pursue, which was that, well, there is a sense in which for many, particularly many gay people, and for a lot of trans people as well, we've got the legislation, haven't we? We've got equal marriage, we've got same-sex marriage, we've got this, we've got that. There has been that kind of sort of progress over the last 10 years or so, and there's a sense of maybe that's demobilised people. And that's something which I've only just started thinking about, really, in any real sense. But it may be something that we should think more about on the left, about how do we intervene in that to push forward and develop those united fronts that we can take on the question of how the cuts are hitting us. Just throw that out there, really. The mental health issue, I absolutely. Well, sorry, there was the comrade at the beginning mentioned the question of essentially a question of stealth, which is and that's a common view. It's absolutely right. Many trans people don't want to be icons. They don't want to be up front. They want to feel that they can live their lives in the gender to which they feel they should be living their lives, and that means going back into society. And many trans people transition and then go back in, if you like, to society, and to be unmasked it can be a disaster, an absolute disaster, and it's quite necessary to have the legislation which tries to stop that. I think there's a lot of younger trans people these days don't actually see that as, because in a way that it can be seen as legitimising the binary gender system, can't it? And there are many young people who reject that notion, I think, increasingly, like young trans people rejecting that notion. I guess for other people, kind of, some of us who transition quite publicly, it's a bit more difficult, isn't it? You're there. What can you do? Anyway. I don't know if that helps. The mental health thing, yeah, there was a whole period in particularly the 1920s, 30s and so on, in which there were attempts to define transsexualism and to define it as a mental health issue. And certainly when I first started going to a gender clinic, that you still do, you had to fulfil certain criteria. In order to access, even under the Gender Recognition Act now, you have to have lived in role for, I think it's 2 years. And you had to, I knew people who used to go along, who always, trans women who used to always, wear jeans and trousers and whatever, but they would put a skirt on in order to go to the clinic, because the psychiatrist, who has to decide whether you're just a little bit crazy, would say, but you're not fulfilling you're not feminine enough, you're not fulfilling the criteria that will get you access to the health service, and that goes on. So it has the latest DSM, the definition, the big book of definitions of mental illness has changed it from being, I think, a syndrome. Was it a syndrome to? From disorder to syndrome or whatever. Yeah. So it's but it's still in there, and of course anybody with an ounce of sense would object to that. I would have thought. Ultimately, we want a society where it's a matter of your choice, not a matter of what hurdles you have to leap in order to reach where you want to go. Right. Sorry, I've dealt with terminology. Mental health, cuts and right. Yes, I think somebody raised Bradley Manning. Was it Chelsea? Yeah, Bradley Manning and Chelsea Manning. I did. That's on page 1 of my article actually, because I think you're quite right. That's actually an incredibly brave thing to do, because she's in a position now where she may have decades of being locked up without access to what she clearly wants and needs.
As well,
yeah, exactly. So, you know, that was an incredibly brave and thing to do, as was the original reason, of course, that she's in jail in the first place. I haven't mentioned cisgender. Again, I mean, it's part of the whole terminology issue, which I haven't got time really to go any further into, other than to say it's not a term I intend to use, but I know other people do. I guess I just want to finish really on what I think somebody was saying about the role of the family, and that being absolutely central to the way I think of transphobia is it emerges as a result of the role of the family, the social relations that arise from the material circumstances of the production of wealth and accumulation of wealth in society. And the family, it's not an accident. You know, the ideology of the family, the existence of the family in reality is about the reproduction of the next, you know, the next labour force and so on, and it's done incredibly cheaply in the family. It's very important to capitalism, and whatever form that family takes, it's clustered around the notion of the nuclear family. And people who are trans, people who are gay, don't fit that. They are implicitly a threat to that family ideology and the family structure, and hence the homophobia and so on that's built in, and to which we are still suffering, and to which we are fighting to overthrow. I'll just finish with the last two slides, which I had and never got to. Oh gosh, that's Sylvia Rivera, by the way. I think this is a good one to end. It's from Leslie Feinberg's book. It's actually a little bit reminiscent of what Engels says at the end of The Origins, where he talks about, look, you know, we can't define, there's no blueprint for how people will live their lives and the relationships that they'll have. It's going to be down to people to work that out for themselves. In a genuinely liberated society, it's up to those people, probably not people of my age, sadly, but a lot of you young people, who knows. In a revolutionary transformation, then you begin to free up the potential to live our lives as we choose to live them, and to love who we choose to love. And that really, I guess, seems to me to be what we all should be fighting for and aiming for in the coming period.